Western Rome's Fall. Tim, Solomia, Betsy, and Tina. Rome wasn't built in a day. It wasn't destroyed in one either. Rome went through a lot: multiple civil wars, plagues, government reforms, and other minor catastrophes. However, many historians agree that one of the main reasons the Western Roman Empire fell was because it lacked the economic base to govern, fight, and meet basic civil demands on the empire and its people. In other words, Rome needed money. There are many reasons as to why the Roman Empire lacked the funds, but chiefly amongst them is the fact that the army was very expensive to run. The sheer amount of manpower and the ever-growing threat of invasion from the outside, Rome needed to pump more money into maintaining itself. Money it didn't have. One way the Roman government tried to correct their deficit was debasing currency, or reducing the amount of precious metals in a coin. This practice began shortly after the denarius, or gold coin, was introduced, but it rapidly took off during Emperor Nero's reign, causing outrageously increased levels of inflation which required raising taxes to correct. The increase of taxes to make up for the decrease in the value of a coin didn't affect all groups. In fact, it really only affected the middle and poorer classes, because what little worth their coinage previously had was then worth even less. Such an increase in taxes caused a strain on the economy because suddenly the cost of living increased, but the amount of income coming in remained the same. Thus, lower classes couldn't make enough profit to support themselves, which led to the middle classes being pushed out. As the middle classes shrank through their migrating or becoming part of the lower classes, the amount of production went down. These factors were results of Rome needed money, but they also can be viewed as reasons Rome needed money. When productivity went down, the government had to make up for lost funds by increasing taxes, which once again made productivity go down and the need for higher taxes rise, and so on and so forth, creating a vicious cycle. The people's alternative to being trapped in this cycle was to essentially sell themselves into serfdom, a type of servitude. Western Rome's economic problems were setbacks for the empire. They weren't the only reasons for its fall. In part, different parts of Rome had different major problems. Also, many empires go through economic problems, but they get through them. Therefore, the questions become, what other crippling events were going on in the empire, and why did those problems have such significance?
As we know, Rome had been having economic troubles around the time it began to disintegrate. To combat this, the 51st Emperor of Rome, Diocletian, decided to make some serious reforms. He painted himself as a very patriotic and people-first emperor to distance himself from previously greedy emperors, and to appeal to the people of Rome and boost morale. He surrounded himself with oriental splendor, styling himself as a divine person, creating a system that secured the people he was closest with powerful positions in the government. He also introduced harsher regulations on trading and tried to combat inflation forcefully. He created legislation for the state control of things like production, prices of goods, and military drafting. These reforms, although they worked decently in the time when Diocletian was emperor, led to economic collapse later on. In the beginning, not following the reforms had a death penalty, which was very unpopular with the public. When the punishments were lightened after Diocletian's death, people simply didn't follow them. In his lifetime, Diocletian increased the tax so much that the working class, such as peasants, small landowners, and merchants, could not pay them, which destroyed the economy even further. But going back to Diocletian's reforms, the harshness of the regulations came at a price. With so many rules that nobody enforced but the public gave money for, corruption became an even bigger problem. With Rome being in a very every-man-for-himself mindset, officials took as much as they could for themselves, leading to even further economic problems since they were taking but not giving. Officials also became powerful and harsh towards citizens. They were given a lot of power, and boy did they exercise it. The government had less control over them, and that led to more corruption. Because of the corruption, although Diocletian had raised morale a bit with his reforms, citizens were on the whole unhappy with Rome and the direction it was headed. Roman citizens had quite a few reasons to be less loyal to Rome, harsh and greedy officials being only one of them. With the rise of monotheistic Christianity, ordinary citizens no longer saw emperors as gods, nor godlike as they had before. Additionally, Christian teachings were more pacifistic, making people reluctant to join the army. That, paired with the obvious worsening conditions around them and oppressive officials, deterred people from joining the military, causing military problems. But Diocletian's most remembered deed is the splitting of the East and West empires. When Diocletian felt the empire had gotten too big and hard to control, he made the executive decision to split in half, into East and West. One half for himself and one half for another emperor, with two other sub-emperors beneath both of them. At first this worked, but eventually the more affluent East became stingier and stingier with its resources, and didn't help the poorer West with outsider attacks or other problems. The split of the empires only created a bigger rift between two already vastly different cultures, and created two entities that were more enemies than allies. This, of course, led to military and economic problems for the West, because of the lack of wealthy port cities on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and in general less affluent population.
So it's clear that one of Rome's biggest problems was the lack of money. But why? One reason is that because of the military, or at least because of what the military needed to defend. Here are the borders the Western Roman government had to defend. There were Germanic tribesmen surrounding Roman lands and moving into Roman territory, and it also made constant raids and invasions. The military was too divided to fight off a sizable enemy. The government also managed resources poorly, and as a result, all the resources available would be taken out after an attack. Unfortunately for the Roman government, the Roman citizens were decreasing in number, and they became more and more disloyal to the emperor in Rome, at the exact time the Roman government needed more soldiers to defend those borders. As a result, the Roman government began recruiting Germanic tribesmen as mercenaries. However, paying these mercenaries and giving them rights cost more money for the Roman government, and whenever the government didn't pay up, bad stuff happened, like the Visigoths sacking Rome. Yeah, that's not great for the Roman government. The famous sacks of Rome and the end of the Western Roman Empire happened a lot in part due to the problems in the military and all the side effects that came from the decline. The end of the Western Roman Empire resembles the decline of the Persian Empire in many ways. The Persian Empire also had large frontiers they had to defend, and struggled to spread out their military throughout their provinces, just like the Romans. The Persians also had many economic issues like the Romans did, and this led to the Persian Empire also being weakened as a whole, so that their military could not withstand major invasions. Rome could not stand against the multiple barbarian invasions, and the Persian Empire couldn't stand against a certain invader by the name of Alexander the Great. The Roman Empire fell as a result of internal issues which were not fixed, and as a result their military could not fight off an invader, and we can see this in Persia as well.
Another vicious cycle that occurred in Rome was with the Germanic barbarians from Europe, who were not monsters, but just as human as the Romans. A tribe called the Vandals, followed by Visigoths and other tribes, sacked Rome several times. However, these were not the brutal attacks and cutting heads off statues massacres they're seen as in paintings and lore. Really, the sackings were as much a civil war and internal problem as an external one. Let me explain. Huns from the east were pressuring Germanic tribes into Roman territory. Since Roman borders were much weaker than Hun ones, Germanic tribes usually chose to interact with Rome. The tribes had three choices: trading with Rome, fighting Rome, or joining Rome. Trading with Rome was the prosperous choice, causing lots of cultural growth in the tribes that chose to do it. However, this didn't last long in most cases because Romans cannot have nice things, leading to the other two relationships in a short time. Germanic tribes also attacked Rome frequently, whether preemptively or in retaliation. The cities on the border of the empire were always being looted or pillaged, ruining the Roman tax system and undermining the government locally and across Rome. Lastly, the tribes also had the option of joining Rome. This was the eventual end of many tribes, and they essentially created a new social Roman class because of all the soldiers in the Roman army. That new social class wanted rights, and it had the willpower, manpower, and large amounts of pointy things to get those rights to them. Thus, the barbarians had infiltrated the Roman Empire as soldiers, generals, and even political officials. This leads us back to those sackings and uprisings that weren't invasions at all, but a threat from Rome's own people. Finally, after sacking Rome, many of those tribes fled. Notably, after the Vandal sacking of Rome, they moved to Spain. The Visigoths, who previously lived there, were forced out into northern Africa, and later returned to sack Rome themselves in 455. There were a bunch of Germanic tribespeople running around Rome at that point, but they didn't destroy Rome. This is part of the dispute over how and when Rome fell. Did it fall when the last emperor was dethroned? Did it fall at the last sacking of Rome? Or did it fall when its ideas died out? Because if that's the case, Rome never fell. Its ideas were absorbed and kept by those Germanic tribes, who later created the Holy Roman Empire in Rome's image. The problems covered in this presentation don't even come close to explaining every reason Rome fell. However, its main economic, social, military, and border problems led to the eventual weakening and disintegration of the Western Roman Empire.